I think we finally got everything synced up, so we're ready to start. My name is David Black. I'm the president and CEO of the SETI Institute, and I'd like to welcome you to the session this afternoon. What we're going to do is give you a summary of the output from a very interesting workshop that we've held here the last 2 days. It had to do with communication across the cosmos. As you know, those of us here at the Institute, one of the things we worry about is how do we potentially detect a message from extraterrestrial creatures of one kind or another. And as part of that, is what is the message? What kind of thing would you be trying to detect? So in order to come to grips with that, one of the things we thought would be a good way to do that would be to have people get together and say, well, what would our message be? How would we construct a message that we might send out into the cosmos, potentially to be picked up by civilizations elsewhere? And the idea being there's a certain amount of symmetry in this problem. If we could figure out what we might say, then it might help us as we struggle to figure out what they might say. So what you're going to hear today are first of all, some short summaries, roughly 10 to 12 minutes, I believe, from some of the speakers, the participants in the workshop, and then that will be followed by a time when we put them up on some bar stools here in front of you and allow you the opportunity to ask questions of the individuals themselves. I can tell you, I'm not an expert in this field, but I can tell you that it was a fascinating 2 days, the talks that I was able to sit in on, and I think you'll find these summaries very thought-provoking as well as interesting. So with that, I'll turn it over to Doug, who has sort of spearheaded this whole thing. Doug's on our staff here, and he can tell you a little bit more about what's going on. Doug?
Thank you, David. As David mentioned, what we'll cover today is simply a summary of some very in-depth, very insightful talks that we had over the last couple of days. So what I'd encourage you to do as we go through rapidly and touch on some of the points, when there are particular topics that intrigue you, just jot down the name of the presenter, and either a first name or last name will work. I think the only redundancy is we had 2 Johns, but one spelled with an H, one without. And if you go to our YouTube channel, Communicating Across the Cosmos, and just put in the speaker's name, you'll see their video. So you can actually watch the talk that happened. And thanks to Lily and our communication staff, those are up and available. Is that right, Lee? Channel's name is SETI Institute. And with the playlist of Communicating Across the Cosmos, a second way to access it is go to the conference website, which is communicating.seti.org. You'll also see full bios and abstracts of all the talks there, and there are links to the videos there as well. The speakers that we had were from 6 countries and from a variety of disciplines, which you'll pick up as you hear a bit about the talks that were presented. In addition to the 3 speakers who will be summarizing the work of some of their colleagues, I also wanted to just acknowledge 2 of the other speakers, and if you stand up, please, Marek Kultis and Morris Jones. And so we'll hear about some of their ideas as well. What we'll be doing now is just doing brief summaries of some of the key ideas, and each of our 3 speakers will take about 10-12 minutes, and then we'll hold questions for each of them until the very end, and as David said, they'll all come up here. So I'd like to begin by introducing Dr. Klara Capova. Klara is a cultural anthropologist with a specialization in the anthropology of science as well as science and technology studies. Dr. Capova is currently a research associate at Durham University in their Department of Anthropology. She also runs a Facebook page called ET Life and Aliens in Popular Culture, which is dedicated to imagined extraterrestrial life forms as they appear in popular culture, science fiction, and art. My pleasure to introduce Dr. Capova.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you, Douglas, for the introduction. Can you hear me? Yes, it's right. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to give you a bit general introduction to what we've been talking about in the past 2 days, and I'm going to talk about language, history, and aims. of the interstellar messaging. So the first question we ask, is language relevant? When we talk about the imagined or unknown extraterrestrial life, do they really develop language? So we suppose that language is a universal means of communication, but there might be limits to the language, which is obviously the reason why mathematics has been used in the past to create a sensible message. We make the others and we assume that they are like us. We're using ourselves as a model, which is a very analogous thinking about how we are, how the others might be. We also assume that all code by humans will continue culture, which is the conclusion Marek made. Basically, whatever message is we're gonna send out, it's gonna be biased by our human experience. We are humans, we are sending human messages. And the other question we ask, do we just want to exchange scientific information, such as the Voyager message that's been sent out? Or shall we just focus on something more generic or common to humankind? Oh, sorry. So we've been talking about alternatives and ideas, but it's something that will be discussed a little bit later. We've been talking about the history of time capsules that offer useful ideas for interstellar communication by spacecraft. Basically, every message we've sent is a sort of a time capsule that is supposed to communicate across time and space. So again, the way we construct the capsules on Earth might be useful analogy. The complexity of being human, or human life on Earth, again, when you look at terrestrial cultures, there are differences in perceptions of female beauty or the other, languages, gestures, translations. It's very easy to get lost in translation, even on Earth. And in the past, I think the scientists are trying to overcome this problem by using languages based on science in belief and might be in a universal language. So, what to send? That's a really good question. That is the question. Well, we might be stating the obvious, but we think we need to look at the possibilities and not to ignore them. So a variety of messages of different times has been discussed, which is something that will be discussed later as well. Finding one common channel to establish communication with the ET. We shall see how we get about that. So we want a dialogue, leave a legacy, or do we just want to exchange scientific information? That's something from the previous slide. It's quite a tricky question, assuming the fact that the interstellar communication is likely a one-way talk. And of course, responsible action requires careful planning. Also, we've been talking about more recent enterprises, such as sending out public messages. So that's one of the things we need to keep track. As we enter the new scientific arenas, careful study, planning, and execution are imperative. That's one of the conclusions we made. We might be going about communication the wrong way. We need radical new approaches. And we need to see that we are Earthlings, and the claim that we are sending a message on behalf of humankind, we also need to include the rest of the humankind into the message. So we basically concluded that the messages that's been sent today are Western or Eurocentric, and one of the ideas we had was to make it more international or global. And that's basically the summary of the first part of the talks. Okay.
Thank you very much, Klara Anna. Our next speaker is Dr. David Dunay. He's a professor of history and ideas at Lund University in Sweden, and also a researcher at the Center for Cognitive Semiotics at the same university. His research concerns the development of science, medicine, mathematics, and technology since the scientific revolution to the present. His latest book is The Natural Philosophy of Emanuel Swedenborg, a study in the conceptual metaphors of the mechanistic worldview. Dr. Dunay.
Thank you. Yeah, a couple of the talks during the second day was concerning linguistic and cognitive scientific questions and philosophy of mind, discussing particular problems around language and the mind. So we know that there is no problem to send out messages out in space. There is no problem to reach other stars with radio signals. And we can also fill these messages with a lot of information. So that's not any problem. But the perhaps biggest challenge for message construction is to make a message that is understandable for the receivers out there. So that's what we're talking about, especially during the second day. And for example, one of the speaker, Kim Binstead, said or showed that there is particular problems to use, for example, natural languages. We can't expect that the aliens understand English so well, so we have to construct other ways of transferring information. And maybe formal languages is not so good idea either, because we have to make representations and use symbols in order to transfer meaning in a message. Even images like pictures are perhaps not any good idea either, because we can't expect that they have the same visual setup that we have. So to read pictures is something we learn, something that is dependent on our sensory equipment. So, and symbols, we have to pack the information in some way in symbols, and they are detached representations and are not something obvious. It's something that we have to learn. And that makes it very problematic to send messages. So how to send a message? We discussed, could we learn something from linguistics? Could our knowledge about human languages say something about how we could construct languages or construct messages? And for example, one of the speakers, Sherry, talked about also the development of languages on Earth, that they are changing over time, of course. So if we are sending a message today in English, we will get in return, if they answer to our question, they will return with an old-fashioned English if we pick it up about 10,000 years from here. So language change all the time in an unpredictable way and in unpredictable rates. So perhaps we could learn something how children learn languages, and even how we try to talk to animals. Interspecies communication might be a way of understanding how we can communicate with other species than ourselves. And probably it would be much easier to talk to a dog or a cat or a dolphin than it would be to talk to an alien, because we share something with the other animals here on Earth. We are sharing the same type of environment and the same physical, and we have also a lot of DNA in common. So another question is, how can we get into the minds of the aliens? And can we learn something from cognitive science and philosophy of mind? Because the problem is that we don't know how they think. In order to be successful in communication, you have to have some idea about the receiver and how he thinks or she thinks. And we don't know anything about the aliens, how they think. So how can we reach their inner minds? And one common way is to share knowledge. And what do we know that they know? Are there any knowledge that we share together? And one classic answer to that question is mathematics. Mathematics should be the same all over the universe, and that could be a way of sharing a knowledge that we both have. But it's not so simple, actually, because we have to pack this information in symbols. And again, that's difficult to decode these symbols that we are using. So, of course, during the whole workshop, we discussed what do we want to tell them. Should we tell them good or bad stories, or good or bad news? And what can we learn from them? If we can pick up information from outer space, what could we learn from them? In my talk, I also said something about shared experiences, how we can share experiences instead of sharing knowledge, and also that we have to focus on intention and attention. The intention in a message, and also that we need to have some kind of joint attention. So a couple of the talks was also discussing the intentionality of the message. Learning and culture is also something typical for information transfer, that language is connected to culture. During the whole workshop, we also discussed what to send, and should we, one extreme answer to that question, that we should send everything we have to stream the internet out into the space, or should we just send a short signal? Kim Binstead had a very good metaphor for how lot we could say with just a signal. If you take the example of a doorbell, if someone is pressing the doorbell, we know that there is someone there, the existence, and the person exists in some location and have some intention by pressing the button, and have some kind of knowledge. He or she knows who to use a button, and a physical capability to do it, and have also models or expectation what will happen if they press the doorbell. So, and I tried to say something about interaction. We could also interact instead of sending messages with information. So we had a lot of recommendations that we put forward during the sessions. Sherry, who is a linguist, she said that if we make a time capsule, we need to look at it periodically to make sure that we still understand what it means. Because our language is changing over time, so we will not understand our own messages in let's say, in 10,000 years. We will not understand what we are saying now. And the ET language may or may not be learnable, and the learnability may not be reciprocal. We could decode it with computers, but once it is decoded, we may not be able to understand and use it. And Kim said that developing a pigeon to communicate based on what we know and what they know. And she had this doorbell message is easy and carries an important information in it, as I explained recently. Brief messages are highly compressed, and it depends on context, so it's unlikely to be interpreted correctly, he said also. And some of my recommendations were that we should perform research, doing more research in cognitive science about cognition in space, and focus on the fundamental cognitive abilities underlying interstellar communication. We have to go into what it makes it possible to have a language and to communicate. What is the fundamental cognitive abilities needed for that? And the third point I had is to, instead of a universal symbolic message that needs to be coded and decoded, try an interaction that is directed to just them, tied to the spatial temporal setting. So instead of sending a quiz to them, we should do something together. And Tomislav, he had the idea that our communicative act should be without any explicit informational content. Our signal should reveal our communicative intent without any specific information intent. In short, he meant that we shouldn't send information. Instead, we should show that we have an intention to communicate. So that's is roughly what we talked about during the second day. So thank you.
Thank you, David. And again, we'll have all of the speakers come back at the end for a panel discussion. For our final speaker, I'd like to introduce Dr. John Traphagan. Dr. Traphagan is Professor of Religious Studies and Anthropology at the University of Texas in Austin, where he's also a faculty affiliate of the Population Research Center. Dr. Traphagan's research interests center on the relationship between culture and science. His past work largely focused on medical concepts and religion in Japan, but currently his main research focuses on the application of anthropological ideas to the field of astrobiology. Professor Traphagan's most recent book is called Extraterrestrial Intelligence and Human Imagination, SETI and the Intersection of Science, Religion, and Culture. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Traphagan.
Thank you, Doug. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the medium, content, and also a bit about perspective in terms of what we send. And we're back to the question, what do we send? And the question this came up before is, do we send a lot or a little? Do we send a ping or do we send the Google servers? And we also have the question of what we say. And a lot of different ideas came up in relation to this. Some people talked about sending things related to journalism, for example, and I'll come back to why some of these are important. Art, music, science, politics, I mean, all these things have been talked about quite a bit in different areas, and this came up. Do we send the good, the bad, or the ugly? In other words, do we try to send ideas about morality? Do we try to send ideas about how we think about beauty? And a question that was very important is to what extent do our cultural biases influence what we choose to send and how we choose to go about saying it. You have to think about interstellar message construction. It's not just a neutral thing. When you construct it, you're making it, and you're making decisions about it in the process of making it. And the one idea that came up is that does the act of constructing the message actually make it more difficult for an alien to understand what we're trying to send because we have put so much bias into it? Another question that came up is, are we maybe too fixated on visual imaging? And should we think of other ways to send things? And the idea of encoding sent and sending that came up. So, and then lastly, question that came up is, can we solve some of these problems by sending some sort of interstellar Rosetta Stone? So I'm going to kind of go person by person here in terms of the group that I'm dealing with. And Patterson, who is interested in art and writing and this sort of thing, she talked a bit about the importance of creating multi-channel systems instead of binary information so that we can send a pluralism of ideas and approaches to get people to send, in essence, the same kind of thing in many different ways so that they can kind of triangulate them. She was interested in engaging poetic imagination and creativity and getting people to be collaboratively involved, and she really wants to extend this to a non-exclusive group. And one of the points that came out, we looked around the room, and we have a fairly narrow group of people in the room talking about this. This excludes large parts of the world. And so she's very interested in a kind of pluralist message that would have wide global participation. She was just interested in finding ways to engage the public in this through various kinds of events that would support the idea of message construction and the content that would be involved with it. And then she had the idea of sending chemical information and signals that would help to show our understanding of the physical universe, and that this is, again, something that we share with an extraterrestrial intelligence. And this is where the idea of scent came up. Jones, who's sitting right here, talked about journalism. And that is a very interesting way of thinking about it, but journalism is an ongoing reflection of how we're thinking about ourselves. So it has a lot of information about what we think about ourselves. He also pointed out that this is really complicated, it's very anthropomorphic, and that makes it difficult to use. It makes it difficult to do something with. But there is the potential there to send a great deal of information about who we are, and there's no specific authorship in it. There are lots and lots of different authors putting it together. So if we sent a lot of journalistic information, it would be coming from many different angles. The other thing that I thought was interesting was that he talked about that, at least in the West, the predilection towards negativism in journalism might help balance some of the tendencies to try to present ourselves in very positive ways. And if you think about things like the Voyager record, it doesn't talk about war and poverty and all the rotten things that humans do. It paints a really nice picture of us. So, in other words, it's lying. Sorry, I couldn't resist. Then Seth Shostak said, well, let's just throw everything at them. We'll throw the kitchen sink. And he said, send the Google servers. And the idea behind this was that, in fact, more is better than less, because we have to assume that if ETI can figure this out, if they can get it, they're really smart. So they ought to be able to find the patterns in the information. If they can decode what's coming, they can then find the patterns and arrive at conclusions about the beings that sent it, all right? That doesn't mean they're going to know what it means. They're not, because they're not going to have the cultural background in order to be able to pull it out of the context. But they're going to arrive at their own conclusions anyway. That's what they're going to do. So just send them as much as possible, give them a lot to work with, and maybe they'll get something out of that. So the more information they have, the easier it may be for them to find patterns. And then my own thoughts related to this, I'm being an anthropologist, I'm particularly concerned with the issue of cultural bias, and also the power of pre-existing theoretical paradigms to shape how we go about constructing these messages, and maybe to the point that it's tacit, we're not even aware that it's doing it. We certainly tend to construct others in terms of our own ideas about the world. When we think about other cultures, we think about other people, we build those around how we see things. And we're going to do that when we're thinking about extraterrestrial intelligence. Assumptions about ourselves may be projected onto our imaginings about ETI and may make it very difficult for them to interpret our messages, because there's so much of us in there. This is something I actually liked about Seth's idea about just sending everything. The advantage to sending the Google servers is it removes one element of bias. Nobody's picking anything, at least in an overt way. Now, there's still a problem, because the Google servers are themselves picked in a way. They represent what's going on among some segments of the world. They do not represent the entire world. So, you know, people who don't have access to computers, people who are impoverished, disconnected, alienated, they don't show up there. But you can't send everything, but at least you can send a lot. And then Wasson, who's an archaeologist, talked about the idea of creating some kind of Rosetta Stone. And one of the points he says is that one of the things we can do is, when we look at ancient cultures here, we use ethnographic comparison. So if we're going to look at what we think is a tribal society from 10,000 or 50,000 years ago or whatever, we might look at a tribal society that we have a lot of information about and say, well, this suggests that maybe they did this based upon the evidence that we have. So maybe extraterrestrials could do the same thing. They get a lot of information from us, and they have some way to decode this with a Rosetta Stone type thing. His idea was that if we can communicate stuff that we think they will know, and this came up before, like scientific knowledge or aesthetic, moral, religious knowledge, then maybe that's a way that they can find something to kind of hook into. And so he asked the question, is there anything on Earth that everyone would know, regardless of what the culture is? And that's a very interesting question. I'm not sure there's a good answer to that, but that's something we need to think about. So in the end, one of the question that I raised in relation to a lot of this is that when we think about constructing interstellar messages, we have to think not just about the text, but also the subtext, what's lying underneath. And one of the things that intrigued me as we went around is we kept talking about what we want to tell them about ourselves. Well, that tells them something about ourselves. And one of the things it tells them, is we're really interested in ourselves. And maybe we're a lot more interested in ourselves than we're interested in them. So we have to be really careful about that underlying message. I think that's actually a very ethnocentric message that comes out of the very Western focus of interstellar message construction and SETI in general, where Americans in particular tend to be pretty self-preoccupied. So imagine E.T. lives in a society where they tend to be very other-oriented, very interested in anticipating the needs of others, and there are human societies like this. They might get the message and go, wow, what a bunch of narcissists. Let's not respond. They're jerks. And so they got the message, but they don't want to talk to us because of the subtext underlying what we sent, what we chose to send. So we have to think a lot about that. And we need to think a lot more about how what we send might be picked up at the other end and what we're not aware that it might be saying. We have to get down there and kind of dig deep and figure out, all right, is there something that we're transmitting that we don't really want to transmit? And I think that's it. So.
Thank you very much, John. Now we'll take about a 5-minute break. We'll bring some chairs up here, and then we'll begin a question and answer. 1 minute break. Speed team.
What we'll do is I'll walk around. If you want to raise a question, just get your hand up, and I'll come around with a mic and allow you the opportunity to grill these people. We have a two-hander. No, that's really good. Do you want them to sit here where they're? Okay. Those of you who are going to sit up here, come on up. Probably good enough, isn't it? Have a seat, please. Please. Is this, we have 3 seats. Is there to be a 4th? Oh, John will be back in a moment. He's exhausted from his talk. All right, you guys ready to rock and roll here? All right, I'll be right up there. We had someone had their hand up first. Ladies first.
Thank you. So I get that you guys were really addressing the how and the what. Do we communicate? On the how piece of it, was there any thought given to musical tones, something that could be both heard and felt? Depending upon how loud you turn it up.
I could take a stab at it. Yeah, Carl DeVito, a mathematician from the University of Arizona, as he was talking about what might be universal, touched on mathematics. So if you can create a radio telescope or transmitter, it seems like you may need to know some mathematics. And he also highlighted the links between mathematics and aesthetics. So there was some touching on that. And also in Carrie Patterson's talk, she talked about how we would communicate something about our inner experience, in that case through a sense of smell, using as an analogy the impact of perfumes. And how maybe we don't, we often think about sending the one right message that gets everything. But she said, when you create a perfume, there are two levels of it. There's the undertone and the upper elements of it.
Kim Binstead also talked about it, and actually she pointed out there are some difficulties with that because there are lots of different ways to represent music. You can send the sound, but then you can send visual representations of the sound, and a lot of things, they wind up looking very different. And so how one would interpret that turns out to be quite difficult. And so she didn't seem to be terribly hopeful about that idea, if I remember correctly. So.
Okay, we've got a question over here.
My question has to do with misinterpretation or even recognizing that some string that you send out has a message from an intelligent source. Has anyone done experiments taking some otherwise random string, maybe segments of the value of pi, and giving the same message, quote unquote message, to different maybe intelligence organizations around the globe and see what they make of it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I tried to take the Arecibo message and give it to different people from different backgrounds to actually read the message. And we found out, and also one of the other speakers were talking about it, that people won't guess what that means without seeking support using the internet. I think, who was the other person?
Kim Binstead also mentioned, who taught a course in computational linguistics, and as one of her exercises, she gave the ones and zeros that were transmitted from Arecibo in 1974, and created an incentive by making it part of the grade with increased points if you got it done rapidly. What she found is that people weren't able to decode it, and even in the case of one student who'd seen it before, they weren't able to interpret it. So the way that's sometimes been discussed in the SETI community is that we're very good at understanding messages when we know what they're all about and we can anticipate it. But if they're unexpected, then we're very bad at it.
Yes, and also once you decode the message, you end up with a pixelated image. So we know its basic concept of chemical elements, but to actually read it is another layer of it.
Yeah, I've actually given the Arecibo message to my students and asked them to tell me what it means. And I get answers like, why is there an M at the bottom? Well, if you didn't know what it's representing, the structure that's related to the dish, you wouldn't know. It looks like an M. And then there's a stick figure human on it. And then students ask, why are there antlers coming out of the head of the human? Because those are the DNA strands. But if you don't know what they are, they look like antlers. So again, without any background, without any context, basically it's indecipherable. That's where I get to with it. When I do this every time I teach a particular course that I have on this topic, and students can never get a lot of these things. They just, there's no way to interpret them. So, yep, go ahead.
Let me suggest that David talk a bit about what's left if we don't have that, because I think this was the idea of communicating the intent to communicate. So it's going to be tough to get clear about the informational content, but what else might we say?
Yeah, I mean, first we have to, the aliens must see that there is a message, anyhow, and that we have an intention to say something, to communicate. So that's the first problem. So they can see that there is an artificial message and not a natural phenomena or something. That's the first issue.
So to kind of follow up on that theme, I have a background in ethnomusicology and anthropology, as well as I write science fiction. So that's where I'm coming from. I see this less as an anthropology kind of experiment, more of an archaeology. And in archaeology, more information is better, right? Like before we had the Rosetta Stone, we couldn't decipher all this writing. And so, and we were lucky to get that one stone. That was sheer luck. So we want to provide multiple kind of Rosetta Stone-esque things. So on the one hand, I think we should maybe send a lot of information, not necessarily all of the information, because it is, as my pal Nick here said, it's like dating. You know, on the first date, you don't want to, like, you know, show them the pictures of the mess you have in your garage or whatever, right? You know, you want to put some kind of spin doctoring on it. But another alternative besides here's all about us or tell me all about you, which could be interpreted as kind of a hostile thing, right? Like a militaristic culture saying, oh, they want to know about us. Why? You know, we could talk about the world, like animals, plants, fungi, things like that. Like the planet, yeah, all that stuff that's outside of this room. So I was wondering if you guys had talked about that. You know, sending a more like, let's talk about the whole ecosphere kind of message, and different ways you might curate that with multiple kinds of things. Because if you send 10 different things intended to be Rosetta Stones with 10 different modalities, maybe they'll get one, right? Have you talked about, did you guys talk about that?
Yeah, I would say Carrie Patterson, again, the artist who focused on trying to indicate something about our sense of smell, was actually trying to get away from us being primarily visual and auditory creatures. I mean, if you look at how much of our brain is related to processing auditory and visual information, it's a lot of our cortex. But the limbic system, the more archaic part of our brain, is responsible for some of these more emotional judgments and is very attuned to a sense of smell. So she was suggesting if we want to capture how life more broadly on Earth engages with the environment, let's look at other sensory modalities like smell.
Another question back here.
Comment and a question. The comment is, the time capsule's been done already. Danny Hillis, the Long Now Foundation, they did a Rosetta Disk project prototype a couple years ago, and whether that's good or bad, it's done. Okay, so the time capsule's been done and the like. But the question I actually had that I addressed to Doug, because I sent a note to Adrian back here, is, did you guys decide to invite David Kahn on your panel?
David Kahn, author of The Codebreakers?
Right. The last chapter of The Codebreakers is about SETI.
You know, one of the unfortunate things about this meeting, and this was from some decades ago, right? This was maybe the 60s or 70s. We haven't engaged with him. So one of the challenges is, you know, we had a great group of about 16 people, but still there are many that we couldn't involve because we wanted a smaller group. But David Kahn's work would be very relevant because it would tap an area that we hadn't, which is, I think, especially relevant to the idea of sending the Google servers, which is a very cryptographic approach, which is if you send enough information, can you find patterns in it? And then if you have patterns, how do you go from seeing regularities to interpreting what they mean? In our workshop, we focused more on the interpretation as opposed to on finding those patterns, but highly relevant to what we're doing.
Yeah, forgive my ignorance. I'm just an 80-year-old grandmother that comes here from time to time to learn. I'm really amazed that, are you assuming that the life that you're trying to find and communicate with looks like us? Because there could be people or animals or plants that can't see or hear or smell. I'm wondering, have we ever thought that we received already some communication of life from anywhere else? And have you thought of a different kind of life form out there? I mean, when somebody talked about plants, you know. Oh, there you go.
Yeah, I think you spot the real challenge and the real problem with communicating in universe, because we will not share anything with the aliens. We would not have the same bodies, not the same biology, not the same history, cultural history. So will be very different, and they could have totally different sensory equipments and are adapted to a completely different environment. So that's the challenge in this, to make messages for someone that we don't share anything with. So we couldn't expect that they should be like us. Probably they are very different from us. But if we want to succeed in communication, perhaps we should try to find aliens with similar adaptation to a similar environment. That might be closer to an understanding of each other, if we are sharing at least some knowledge about our environment.
I think the only real assumption that you make here is that they're intelligent, whatever that might mean. That is to say, they have developed whatever technologies are required to receive a signal. What form they take and what experiences they have and everything else is completely open. It's a blank board on which we write. So, but you have to assume that they're intelligent, whatever it is.
Oh,
Go ahead.
I was going to add just one more point. I think this is a really, key issue. And another way to think about this is to say, well, if they're simply too different from us, we probably can't communicate anyway. And so there's a certain logic in at least keeping it within kind of a general range of the way we do things, because that's who we're going to be able to communicate with. So I think there's a kind of two-sided problem there. And one side is that, if they're really different, maybe we're doing the wrong thing. But also if they're really different, maybe we just can't say hello to each other anyway. And so that's a limiting factor.
Yes, of course. I basically wanted to say something similar. To be able to detect and understand the message, the other life form has to be intelligence, which is the basic assumption we make. That's how it is. And another thing is, there is another layer to the messages we send, and that's also that you're always trying to communicate across time and space. So basically, once the message will be received, it will always be a message from past humankind. It depends on how, the distance is in the universe. So that's another thing I wanted to add.
I want to offer a glimmer of hope. Carl DeVito, the mathematician who very understandably focused on mathematics as something that may cut through for any technological civilization, also mentioned during our discussion period in passing this great classic work by a husband and wife team, an anthropologist and a physician, Jonas and Jonas, called Other Senses, Other Worlds, and you can get it as a used book for a couple of bucks. And what they do is try to extrapolate from other creatures here on Earth who use different sensory modalities than vision and hearing to imagine what their worlds and their cultures might be like. So for example, the olfaxes are these olfactory creatures who communicate through a sense of smell, and so if they want to have their name, they would have like think of it like one of those scent things that you have in a car. That might be their name tag. And so what does it mean to communicate if you have a sense of olfaction? Very different sense of maybe even time and space, because if you use vision and hearing, you can locate objects precisely in time and space. Not so much if you use a sense of smell. So maybe we can learn from comparative psychology about how other creatures here on Earth use different senses.
So you mentioned mathematics. I mean, I don't know whether you guys discussed it, but basically when you look at languages across the world, if you're trying to translate from one language to another, you have to find something common to start off that translation. Mathematics to me is no more than another language, and its formal symbolism is invented by the humans who do it. The laws of physics underneath all that are universal and should be used to translate, but how you do the formalism and write the language down of mathematics to me is no different to English, French, German, or anything else. So how do you get around that in terms of how do you encode it in a message as the laws of physics as opposed to our formal language that we use to describe them?
That's exactly my critique also to mathematical messages, because you have to code it in something. You have to use symbols, and the mathematics we are using is a cultural product of the human species, of our species, and it's not sure that this is the only way to do mathematics. Yeah, you could say it's a language, or yeah. At least it's you have to, if you want to send a mathematical message, you have to code it in some way, in a language, and yeah. So it's a sort of language, you could say. It's a representation of something outside ourselves.
Historically, the way this problem has been addressed in interstellar message construction is to try to find some way of sending something as basic as possible. So, for example, Carl DeVito, who we keep coming back to, has suggested that maybe mathematics on other worlds is very different, but maybe something like counting may be a foundation. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If you don't have that, then maybe there's no hope for commensurability. But then how do you know, our numbers, Arabic numerals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, of course, arbitrary symbols. But Hans Freudenthal's Linkos would have a series of pulses, 1 pulse, 2 pulses, 3 pulses. Does that work? We don't know for sure, but that's the best that's been proposed so far.
1 pulse, 3 pulse.
Yeah.
No, that's right. That's right. It's, I'm here, I'm halfway intelligent, so do you want to talk?
Yeah, this topic brings up a lot of really interesting questions, and it seems as though until we can engineer for ourselves an epistemological barometer that tells us whether or not we're kind of on the right track, that it really is a unique challenge. But it also is a really interesting exercise sort of in earthly self-portraiture, and it seems that in trying to eradicate cultural bias, that might actually be something that tells us a lot more about our own cultural biases. And so I was kind of wondering sort of how you guys are planning to kind of archive this material, or if any thought has sort of been given to how future historians or anthropologists or archaeologists might be able to interact with and use this information.
One of the issues that Klara had mentioned and Al Harrison also talked about a lot is the idea of time capsules. And as Sherry Wells Jensen, our linguist, said, if we send a time capsule, we may need to go back and re-update the language because English is changing so rapidly. If you compare contemporary English with Old English, maybe we can get it, but go back another 1,000 years and it would be very hard. So even updating that. But again, going to the example of the Long Now Foundation that we heard about from the audience, that's an example of an organization that wants to communicate on the scale of 10,000 years. And so it may involve some updating, but the idea of having an archive, so there is allegedly an archive of space capsules if you search on the internet. But Al Harrison, who tried to track it down, wasn't able to get a response about whether this repository really exists. But that's the kind of thing that you'd need to do. If we send a message out, we'd certainly want to remember what we sent in the first place. Maybe it's like an email and they append the original message, let's hope so. But if they don't, it would be nice to know what they're responding to. But that really requires thinking in multi-generational timescales.
And I think one other aspect of what you've asked, I think, is that part of why we do what we do is ultimately if we can wrestle with how we can better communicate with something we don't know much about at all, maybe ultimately it will inform us in how we might communicate with each other.
So I was just thinking about the medium that you use in order to transmit these messages. Talking about time capsules, but any time capsule that we send is going to take 10,000 years, I think was. But if it's light, some wavelength or other, in using information from planet finders, Kepler and such, if you can start targeting, if you thought about that.
Absolutely. In fact, with our current SETI search, we have been targeting those stars that the Kepler mission has identified planets around. When we first started doing this, of course, we didn't know how prevalent planets were. Now we know that almost all stars have planets. And so the trick, though, is now as we come to know about terrestrial-like planets, they're a much more likely target. And especially in the coming years, as the TESS mission is launched, that's really focused not on distant stars, but ones closer to home that'll be Earth-sized. That's where we can really find out where should we be putting our attention. Absolutely, because we don't count on the Voyager spacecraft. That's on its trajectory, and it's going to take 70,000 years before it comes within a light year of a star. But if we get lucky and nearby stars are populated, even then it's a minimum of about a decade, but more likely hundreds or thousands of years.
Time for one more question.
Hi, Doug, can you just give us kind of the compressed version of some of the things you came away with from your Earth Speaks study in terms of what humans want in the message content? Fascinating study.
The SETI Institute has had a project to really get at one of the things we've been discussing is how do we move beyond a small group of specialists like we've gathered here in the past couple of days to get input more globally. So go to our website, earthspeaks.seti.org, send us your text messages, sound files, images. So far we've gotten messages from about 70 people around the world, and primarily text messages. And one of the ways we analyze them is to look at how often the words are used in those messages compared to English in general. And to me, one of the most interesting things is, we see words like galaxy and universe used much more often, not a big surprise. And words like of and the, about as often, no surprise. The surprise to me is that we find the word but used about 150 times more often than English in general, and it's used in sentences like, I want to make contact, but my neighbors aren't ready. So I think the messages that we would want to send to extraterrestrials say something about our ambivalence or our uncertainty, or at least, actually I think it's underestimating how ready others are to make contact, because I'm hearing a lot of people saying that, but I think a lot of people are ready.
All right, thank you very much. We could thank our panel here. And I hope all of you will go home and think about this and discuss it with your neighbors as well and see what they might think about the problem. Thank you very much for coming.